Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this ESPON Territorial Research Conference on new research avenues for territorial development and cohesion in Europe. My name is Gavin Daly. I am a research and policy manager at the ESPON EGTC, and I have the pleasure in introducing this event to you this morning and moderating this first panel discussion. ESPON is an EU-funded programme that bridges research and policy. We provide territorial analysis, data and maps to support EU development policies with facts and evidence. In our work, we help public authorities to benchmark their region or city, identify new challenges and potentials, and shape successful development policies for the future. This ESPON Territorial Research Conference aims to investigate new research avenues for territorial development and cohesion in Europe in the context of current global developments. It is about exploring new methods, new approaches, and innovative ideas to support territorial development and cohesion. And that's why we are here today. Our discussion will be structured around 4 sessions. New innovative approaches are sometimes facing scepticism and distrust from policymakers and citizens. In this first session, Navigating Distrust and Reinforcing Expertise, we will discuss the challenges of political distrust and the critical role of evidence-based governance in combating regional inequalities. We will explore innovative approaches to bridge the gap between territorial research and policymaking until around 11 a.m. Then in the following 3 sessions, researchers will present and discuss new ideas, evidence and research avenues that have not yet been addressed within the ESPON 2030 programme. At around 11:15, session 2, AI for Territorial Futures, Scientific Innovation and Policy Intelligence in European Spatial Planning, will start. It will bring to the forefront how artificial intelligence, computational methods are redefining the practice of territorial governance in Europe. We'll then have a break for lunch, and in the afternoon we will start at 2 p.m. with session 3, Revitalising Europe's Economic Base, New Spatial Frameworks for Competitive and Cohesive Territories. This session will explore how regions, especially less developed and structurally vulnerable ones, can rebuild and realign their economic bases in the face of transition challenges. Then at 3:30, the final session 4, Making the Invisible Visible, Next-Gen Approaches to Inequality Mapping, will start. It brings together innovative approaches to mapping, understanding territorial inequalities in Europe. The presentations will show approaches moving beyond traditional indicators to reveal hidden territorial patterns. And then we'll finish at around 4:45. So this event is not just another discussion. It's a dynamic talk show style event designed to foster real engagement. So we would like to engage not only those in the room, but also you, the remote audience. We want to hear your thoughts, involve you in the conversation and answer your questions. So during the sessions, you will be able to take part in polls and send your questions and comments via Slido. You can do that by either accessing the QR code, which is on the screen right now, or by going simply to your browser and typing sli.do and entering the code #ESPON. So, when looking at very recent policy discussions, an increasing distrust in scientific evidence-based policy making can be observed. Scientific research results are often questioned by citizens and politicians. The man-made influence on climate change is just one example. Measures to fight the recent coronavirus pandemic are another. So we wanted to explore which challenges rooted in political distrust and the declining role of expertise in policy making are we facing today. Scientific analyses show that regional inequalities can result in political discontent and distrust. Regional disparities really matter. So how can evidence-based governance contribute to reducing these perceived regional imbalances? We need strategies to strengthen trust in science and enhance its impact on decision-making at EU, national and local levels. But how can we bridge the gap between territorial research and policy making? So in this first session of the conference, Navigating Distrust and Reinforcing Expertise, we will discuss these very questions with selected experts. And we are happy to have a panel of very interesting and distinguished participants here today. So first, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers for this panel session. Professor Hans Westlund is a professor in urban and regional studies at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm. Professor in entrepreneurship at the Jönköping University, Sweden, affiliated professor at the Institute of Development and Strategic Analysis, Ljubljana, Slovenia, and visiting professor at the Tianjin University, China. He is a fellow of the Western Regional Science Association, Between 2019 and 2021, he was member of the Swedish Prime Minister's National Innovation Council, and in 2023 and 2024, he was president of the Regional Science Association International. His work reflects on international as well as European developments relating to trust in policymaking. So welcome, Hans. Sébastien Bourdin is Professor of Economic Geography and Environmental Management at EM Normandy Business School in France. Sébastien is also the chairperson of the European Chair of Excellence on Circular Economy and Territories. His expertise lies in regional development, ecological transition and environmental management. He also is a specialist in European issues, including cohesion policy and public policy evaluation. In his research, he combines quantitative methods such as spatial econometrics and modelling with qualitative methods to offer a comprehensive perspective. Alexandra Olajos-Szabo is a policy analyst at the European Joint Research Centre, focusing on evidence-informed policymaking and capacity building in government. She has played a role in advancing EU policies on innovation, regional development and cohesion, and smart specialisation strategies. Her career spans programme policy management roles in the European Parliament and in different Director Generals of the European Commission, with a focus on research, innovation, policy, competitiveness programmes and regional development. She holds an MSc in Management and International Economics from the Corvinus University of Budapest. And lastly, and by no means least, I'd like to introduce Francesco Molica, our observer and commentator of the session. Francesco is a director of EURADA, the European Association of Development Agencies, and a doctoral researcher in economics at the University Libre de Bruxelles. Previously, he worked as an economic and policy analyst at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, where he researched on regional innovation policies. He also served as director for the EU budget and regional policy at the Conference of Peripheral Maritime Regions. He is the author of various policy academic papers on regional science, innovation policies and EU studies. As an experienced policy advisor, he will bring in the policy development view. So, without further ado, let's start the discussion, and let's commence with the challenge science and policy making is facing. So first, we will look at the root causes of political distrust and scepticism towards scientific expertise. And the very first question I'd like to pose to you, our audience, is, from your point of view, what are the reasons for the rise of political discontent and distrust towards scientific expertise, as well as policy decisions in Europe? Please share with your thoughts using Slido. As I mentioned, you can do that either by accessing Slido via the QR code, which is on the screen right now, or by going to sli.do on your browser and entering the code word hashtag ESPON. We will collect your ideas and hopefully pick them up during the discussion. So maybe I'll turn to Professor Westlund first. He has analysed current international developments challenging trust in policymaking. Current global economic and social developments are playing an important role. Professor Westlund can draw a line from these recent international developments to the local level. So Hans, from your point of view, how can you explain the political discontent and distrust towards scientific expertise as well, and policy decisions? And are these differences in trust in scientific evidence between local, national and EU level policy making? How are they manifesting?
Well, I think it's necessary to start with a broader perspective and a more long-term perspective, because these are long-term processes that we cannot really solve with a quick fix. About 40, 50 years ago, the knowledge economy had its breakthrough. ICT became the important thing. And this turnaround of the economy after the industrial economy made it, some people very rich, but most people did not gain so much from it. So this has created winners and losers at various spatial levels, at the individual levels, in districts and places and regions. And many people and places have been left over. And leftover people, they lose their trust in what we can call authorities or the establishment, that is politicians, officials, business leaders, but also professors and researchers. And universities are considered as a part of the establishment. Then, let's say, we have populist politicians make use of this distrust in the establishment. Just look at what President Nixon said, say, 50, 60 years ago. This could also have been said by the current president in the US. So the professors are enemies of these populists, because professors most often base what they say on science. This distrust in authorities and the establishment, we can call it's an expression of the zeitgeist. That is, one expression we can say is grab what you can, otherwise someone else will do it. And certain individuals seem to consider themselves also to stand above the law. For example, in Sweden we have a minister that some years ago was sentenced for defamation. Yeah, she confessed and so on, but later on she said, no, I think I was right anyhow. And when politicians behave badly, why should not everyone be able to behave badly? So this, I think, is a real problem. Distrust in research is a part of the general distrust. And probably also the growing distrust among people. And therefore, I would say that restoring trust in research, isolated from other components of society, is very difficult. But of course, we must do what we can. I think we can discuss the case of distrust in research in several sources, I would say, because on the one hand we have that politicians deny research results and say that no, it isn't like that, that's just an opinion. I can take another example, Swedish example. It's about 10 years ago that one of the measures that the government at that time had against youth unemployment was that the employers did not have to pay the employer's fee for people under a certain age. The Institute for Labour Market Research in Uppsala, Sweden, evaluated this reform and found that it had, in principle, no effects. And when journalists asked the minister in charge for this, she said, oh no, it can't be like that. I've met several employers and they haven't employed young people and so on. So lift up individual examples and deny the results of scientific research. That's one thing. Another problem is that journalism simplifies and distort research results. Nowadays we can say that the click is much more important than the content. And it is a sort of built-in journalism that it should be a bit spectacular, so they lift up and facilitate research results. Then we come to the third problem, which is quite natural, that researchers present divergent results. That's what we do the whole time. We look at what others have done, we investigate and find maybe it should be modified and so on. Journalists help to make this a bit more simple. So one day you can read in papers, a glass of wine each day is good for your health. Next day you can read, oh no, research said you shouldn't really drink any alcohol at all. Yeah, what should people believe, really? Then we also have the problem that certain researchers act as politicians. They act more from an ideological perspective, but present it as facts. And here, well, I could say at least economists are quite good in that way. Not every economist, of course, but some definitely in their belief that the market is the only thing that should make things work. This have been so for a long time that, for example, unemployment was blamed that people demanded too high wages. But that is, of course, not the only problem. Keynes showed that 80, 90 years ago. Then, still another problem is that researchers present research results whose consequences threaten people's living standards. For example, now fighting against global warmings is met by higher taxes, also recommended by economists, higher taxes on transportation, fuel, and so on, which make it more difficult for people to commute and to keep their living standards. So the solution, is there any solution to this? Well, maybe, I don't know if I have, these are the quarreling researchers. Well, I would say that we should be perhaps a bit more humble, say admit or stress that social science is no absolute science. It develops and we find new solutions, new truths. This is absolutely necessary to say that we don't have the big truth. Then, we should do what we can to enlighten the establishment, politicians and so on. We must not stop and say that they don't listen. We must force them to listen. A third thing that would be very good if we could enlighten the populists. That we can ask, is that even possible? I don't know, maybe some of them. But most of all, patience. Patience is necessary. This is a match with many rounds, and we won't win the first round, but in the end, I think there is some hope anyhow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I share some of your skepticism of our economics colleagues. And maybe I'll turn to you, Francesco, in terms of when you listen to what Hans just discussed, how are politicians feeling when they're confronted with this general distrust in their daily work? And how does it affect what they do?
Yeah, I guess nowadays policymakers and decision makers, they have very often the feeling that they have limited impact, that their actions have limited impact on this trust toward institutions, toward research. And the reason, I think there are essentially two reasons why. The first one is that this distrust, the root causes of this distrust pertain to a number of areas that not necessarily and not entirely fall under the remit and the powers of a specific policymaker. Right? So in order to address these root causes, one would need a great deal of cooperation across organizations, across levels of government, which is not a given, definitely. And the second reason is that, as it was said, these causes, the policies that are designed to address these causes, they take time in order to generate benefits, right? It's a medium to long-term process. And this clashes, definitely, with political cycles, at least in Europe, and it clashes with the fact that people have more and more short-term expectations because of the zeitgeist, indeed. So it's a very complex, indeed situation, but I would like to end this short intervention with an optimistic note. When you look at the fact that local politicians, local policymakers are very much trusted by local communities because every survey, every poll tells us that. I feel optimistic in that I think that there's a way in that, local policymakers can communicate and liaise with local communities in such a way to at least reduce and lower the distrust toward institutions and research. And we have some very good examples of that across Europe and across the many various territories of Europe.
Sure. Sometimes I feel that many politicians accept the confirmation bias insofar they accept the evidence which suits their preordained ideological position rather than the actual neutral evidence. But maybe we'll move on to our next speaker, Sébastien. Research hypotheses have showed that certain influence or distrust and political discontent has researched the behavioural political economy of place-based policies. It came up with the acronym NIME, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about. Not in my electoral year, which I assume is a play on the word NIMBY, not in my backyard, or YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. And I'll explain that in a moment. I'm interested in hearing about that. He also says that scientists often remain disconnected from political realities, which I think is true. We often live in ivory towers. So maybe, Sébastien, from your point of view, what role do regional disparities play in this regard, which is critical for ESPON and our work that we do? And what can researchers do to bridge the gap between science and politics? Thanks.
What we can first say is that distrust is not only citizen-driven. It involves elected officials too. And local policymakers often reject scientific findings when this threatens short-term political gains. So this is an aspect that has been overlooked so far, and we need to consider it. And there is an annual survey in France asking the French citizens about the ecological transition, about their behaviors regarding ecological transition. And there is a question about, do you trust science regarding the climate change evidence? And when you look at the results, it's crystal clear that the people that are living in territories where there is economic decline or where there is structural weaknesses, it definitely sharp sensitivity to political behavior rejecting science findings. And I have many examples about this issue. In this recent paper, I tried to analyze why some elected officials are trying to push place-based policies on the ecological transition while others are not. And what we can say is that it is a real complex situation where there are many pressures from everywhere, coming from the parties, coming from the wing to the right parties or the left parties. It comes from also the pressure from the citizens, and it brings me to the second slide about the not in my electoral year effect. I use this term to reflect on the hidden political bias against science-based policies evidence during election cycles. I have many examples. I have been working for many years on social acceptance of renewable energies. And most of the time, at the very beginning, the local elected official, the mayor, is pushing for the energy transition, and he's saying we need the energy transition at the local scale, and is planning to install some wind turbines or biogas unit on his territory. And is relying on science to justify the fact that we need renewable energies at the local scale. And then, when you see that there is a local association of inhabitants saying that we don't want these wind turbines in our territory, and so on and so forth, then, finally, the mayor is saying, oh, okay, I understand your point, and yes, maybe the science is not so evident, and so on and so forth. So at the end, yes, most of the time they are relying on this not in my electoral effect. And the consequence of this NIMBY effect is that green transition and place-based policies reforms are postponed, regardless of evidence. And there is also another example in France recently. It was on Monday. The government announced that they will stop the low carbon emission zones, which is quite surprising regarding the scientific evidence about the positive impact of low carbon zones on on the carbon emissions. So we can see here that it's also a not in my electoral year effect. The presidential elections will come very soon, let's say. Yes, this is really important to address this. So what I think is that researchers must recognize that timing, political calendars, electoral incentive shape for sure the policy receptiveness to the scientific discourse. And yes, this is a point that we need to pay attention. Another important aspect, so we did a recent study with Francesco Molica and Annabella Santos about the green discontent. And some of the citizens in Europe are saying we are doing too much for the planet, and others are saying we are not doing enough for the planet. And there is here an ambivalence that creates confusion and weakens the science legitimacy. Because, of course, if you look at the discourse of those that are saying we are doing too much or those that are saying we are not doing enough, are relying on scientific evidence. And when science supports both regulation and restraints, for example, it is seen as ideologically manipulated, and in France it's crystal clear. Most of the time the extreme right parties are saying that the science is manipulating the people and so on, and we should not trust the science systematically. And if we take the example of Trump, let's say that it's quite important to think that we have a world leader here. He has a lot of followers on Twitter and other social media. And on his social media, he's saying that climate change is not existing. Or recently he said that climate change has been invented by Chinese. So, but the thing is that at the end, there are local officials, elected officials, and also citizens that are believing him. So we need also to change this angle and this point of view, and as researchers try to be more embedded in the way we are explaining the results of our finding. And what I really want to say is that we need to adapt the messages to local political cultures and institutional settings. We need to adapt the discourse to our audience to embark it, otherwise it doesn't function really well. And finally, what I can also say is that scientists can be really seen as territorial mediators. And I have a lot of examples around the table. We all have already been involved in Horizon Europe projects or Interreg projects. And in this type of project, collectively, we are designing political decisions within living labs, for example. And in these living labs, we are gathering all together the researchers, the local authorities, the citizens, plus the firms, the companies, and so on. And we are trying to push a collective local strategy. And I think that in this sense, stakeholders' engagement builds credibility and ownership when it's co-designed.
Yeah, I think much of your work will be backed up by the work by Andres Rodriguez Pose and similar type of the importance of territorial patterns and cohesion in scientific distrust. So maybe I'll turn again to you, Francesco, in terms of how far do you think that territorial patterns are relevant in this whole debate around political distrust in science?
They are very relevant. They are very important as determinants of distrust towards science and toward institutions at large. At least in Europe, but not only in Europe, I would say. And it's important to stress that 15 to 20 years ago, we couldn't have had this conversation because they were very neglected, these territorial patterns in terms of the literature looking into the influence of territorial patterns on political distrust, on political discontent is relatively recent, right? So I'm glad that today we can discuss finally about it. But of course, these are not the only factors at play. There are factors that are more macro, at domestic, national, or even supranational level, right? Think of the role of media or social media in particular. Think of cultural values, for instance. And there are factors that are more micro. Think of cognitive factors, psychological factors, and behavioral factors. And the research of the work of Sébastien also has looked into it. So I think it is a matter of looking into how these three dimensions interact one with the other, to have a fairly comprehensive overview of how different factors influence indeed the distrust over science.
I think it's interesting insofar as we often think about territorial inequalities and political distrust in the context of right populism, but I'm not sure how far territorial inequalities affect left populism. But that's something. But maybe we'll come back to that at the end. Maybe I'll turn to you, Alexandra, next. So as a policy advisor at the Joint Research Centre, your work in the fields of evidence-informed policy making, you know about the relationship between science and policy making, and any thoughts on how to bridge that gap? So where do you see the main issues are in terms of how policymakers and scientists can bridge this gap between evidence-informed policy making and political distrust? And how can researchers highlight the policy relevance of their research, particularly in the work that maybe like ESPON does, and particularly what we try to do is try to bridge that gap. So maybe you could enlighten us on some ideas. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you, colleagues. I think we all agree in the basis that we have a problem with trust between policymaking and scientists in the world, and it's a growing problem. But let me start by widening this scope a bit, because when people stop trusting science, they don't really stop trusting knowledge, in my view, but they stop trusting the notion and the feeling that their needs, their struggles are reflected in this knowledge. So we have to take into account that it's not against knowledge, this distrust always, but it is stemming from the fact that they don't feel themselves be in the story. So I'm coming from the Joint Research Centre, as you just said, and which is a very unique institution because we are the science base for the Commission, and we are embedded in the policy-making cycle in different stages of the European policy-making procedure. We anticipate with trends, foresight, we integrate and impact the policy-making cycle, but we have a very, so to say, privileged position because we were established for that. But when it comes to our lives are governed by laws, and laws are made by politicians. And politicians also are in a difficult position that they need to look for information and sources. And they also have to pose the question that who can they trust as well. And trust in governments is in linear correlation. We can see from I'm sorry, I forgot to bring the slides. Yes, change the slide. You can see it in the OECD survey that people think that when governments are using evidence, then their decisions are more trusted. Then there is a linear correlation between the two. But trust in science and political institutions are declining in Europe, that we cannot deny. And also lagging regions are even more left behind. They feel more being out of the discourse. And but we have to also take into account that the local actors are not only, so to say, role players and users of the laws, but they are also the co-creators. So we and you in ESPON, with the regional discourse and regional data, you have to help to co-create from local level the decision making. But the good news is that the Eurobarometer, if I'm not mistaken, by 65% or 68% says that people think that scientists should engage with politicians. So people don't think that science and policy making are two different words, but they are striving for putting more evidence in political decisions. And why evidence matters? Because evidence is that provides the best available picture of reality, and also people, citizens, feel it very much. We agree, I think, all of us, that evidence matters, but it's very crucial that who and how are using this evidence. The who, when it comes to the who, it's important to see that we are talking about an ecosystem. We are not only talking about the demand and the supply side of evidence. We are not only talking about separate groups of role players, politicians, policymakers, separately from science from them. But we are also talking about an ecosystem and all the role players who are related to evidence, who are using evidence, who are producing evidence, who are translating evidence. They all need to be part of the policymaking cycle. That's why the evidence-informed policymaking is a product of an entire ecosystem, and we like to use better the notion of evidence-informed policymaking than evidence-based policymaking, because that gives the notion that along the whole policymaking cycle, evidence is channeled. So it's not only that we are underlining political decisions with reliable facts or with necessary facts sometimes, but also that in each and every section of the policymaking cycle, evidence is present. But how do we do this? How do the actors act together? With the GRC in the last 2 years, we conducted a project with 7 member states, a multi-country project, when we were looking at the foundations of a well-functioning EIPM ecosystem. It was not a consultation exercise or a research as such only, but we really mapped the, so to say, the power dynamics of evidence, that where are those points in the policymaking cycle where evidence matters, how are they used, how do the actors of the EIPM, as we call it, evidence-informed policymaking ecosystem, works together. So we created difficult conversations between scientists. We put them, scientists and policymakers, we put them in sometimes unusual discourse, but we made sure that they are all heard and connected, and they talk to each other. It sounds banal, but in the countries with which we were working together, stemming from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, a lot of players didn't know each other. Not only that they didn't know each other, but they didn't have the everyday manner or habit to talk to each other. So sometimes when politicians were looking for evidence, they didn't know where to stand, and the scientists were not embedded enough in the policy-making cycle that at the right time, the right evidence would be for the disposal of politicians. We also made a systemic multi-level analysis at individual, organizational, and system level. We mapped that who are the ecosystem role players, how are they connected to different institutions, how these institutions are working together, and how does the ecosystem level has a well-functioning nature. What were the learnings of this project? What is very important, and I think I said it already at least 10 times on purpose, that the ecosystem approach matters the most. Because we cannot look at to individuals, we cannot look at to different parts of the decision-making cycle, but we have to make sure that this all works together very well. So coordination, leadership, incentives in both sides are very important. Scientists need to be incentivized to channel their opinion to policymakers, which is not always the case in all the countries, and policymakers need to be opened for from the very beginning of posing the question until the evaluation of the impacts of the decision making. What is also very important that we have to share a language, which is also sounds a bit banal, but scientists and policymakers are not always using the same words, are not always having the same notion, not always having the same understanding of different issues. What is also very interesting and important learning is that the dynamics of the science for policy ecosystem, the evidence-informed policy-making ecosystem, that there are current needs and there are future improvements and the possibilities of future improvements, and we have to find a way how to get there. Also that member states face very similar challenges. They have similar actors in the ecosystem. They have similar problems, but their evidence-informed policy-making ecosystem is at a different level of development. So they don't, if we propose a solution which works very well in the UK, we didn't work with the UK, but it is a good example usually because they have a good system for informing policy decisions. It doesn't necessarily work in the Baltic states or in the Mediterranean countries, depending on their science for policy capacity, how much they can absorb, and also there are different problems of coordination. So the place-based approach and the tailor-made approach to local differences is very important. The communication and the maintained dialogue between policymakers and scientists is key. That's also a big learning, which sounds evident, but if it is not maintained, then there is no information flow that feeds into evidence and policy making. Also, the trust emerges from relationship and not only better evidence. So it's not enough if we have a key to the best solution, but I also have to have a relationship, a trusted relationship with the policymakers in order to channel the scientist opinion. And regional and local engagement increases further trust, because then from the citizens up till the decision makers, everybody feels heard. Because we were talking about researchers, and your question was also focusing more on researchers. What can researchers do to channel their evidence? That is my last slide, if I see that. We have some tips and tricks to researchers. I hope you can use it very wisely in the future. That is very important for scientists that first they need to understand policy making. They need to understand the policy making cycle. They need to know that their evidence, the scientific evidence, can be channeled at which point of the policy making cycle. Also that they need to question the question. We shouldn't, as scientists, assume that we know that what we are doing and the question is perfect. We have to challenge how is the question posed by the policymakers. So to start with. Scientists also need to team up, widen the network, not only using the usual input or not only channeling evidence when they are asked to channel the evidence, but they have to have a living network which is channeling evidence into policy making. Also, scientific evidence needs to be contextualized so that policymakers can rely with it, can understand it better. Scientists need to provide options in order to have a better understanding, and also to open different avenues to policymakers. And thank you, Professor already mentioned that scientists need to be aware of the values that they are for, and also their bias, and distinguish values from facts, and communicate it accordingly. So in a nutshell, what I can say for scientists, that science needs to shape the question, not only answer it, and we shouldn't forget that evidence is not an opinion, but it is a basis for a future. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think looking at one of your graphs there, I think one of the challenges we also face is the complexity. There's so much complex research happening in institutions, European institutions across Europe, breaking that down, but also the language, the methods we use, and how we break that down into local and regional decisions is key. But maybe I'll turn back to you, Francesco, in terms of what do you think that scientists and policymakers can use to make better policy decisions, and what do they expect from scientists? How can they really get this information down to actual concrete results on the ground?
I think one key point raised by Alexandra is how you use science in policy making, how sciences feed into policy making. And my experience, both as a policy advisor and researcher, often sitting in between, right, these two different worlds, is that policymakers may tend sometimes to as you said rightfully, to use evidence to justify pre-cooked decision or pre-ordered decisions, right? And we should, as much as possible, avoid this. So many policymakers, they make decisions and then look for evidence to justify or corroborate it. And I think it is important that we, as much as possible, avoid this tendency to cherry pick science. And that's why I would champion also a different idea. We tend to use the term evidence-based policy to say that policymaking should be grounded in science. I think we need to use a different term, evidence-influenced policy, meaning that science is there to influence policymaking, not to cover or not to justify it. And this is a difference that, this is a nuance that it is in any case, however, quite important in my opinion, and I think we need still to, there's still some work to do on that.
Yeah, indeed. I think I was listening to a debate recently on the housing crisis in my own country, Ireland, and there was a graph presented which showed certain evidence, and the politician just refused to believe the graph. The graph was wrong rather than, than the perspective. So, I mean, maybe we can just turn to Slido. I'm not sure if we've got any interesting comments in for Slido, but in the meantime, maybe one of the things that ESPON is really focused on is governance mechanisms and how we embed better governance mechanisms that can allow better trust in policy making. So improving local and regional governance to do that. So I'm not sure if maybe Hans, you have any insights on what we can do to improve kind of governance, the type of decision making, the structures that would allow for better embeddedness of scientific research into policy, to allow for a more maybe enlightened policy domain. I'm not sure if you've any reflection on that. I know it's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, I mean, it has already been up here that at the local level we probably can do more. We could be more active in the sort of public debate, but then underscore that this is not the absolute truth, but still try to come up with evidence and facts and research results, and say that if you want to achieve a political goal, then this might be the right way to go, and this might not be the right way to go. So I think in particular social scientists in all the various disciplines could be more seen in the public debate, but in the right way, not in the way that we are always right, because we're not.
I mean, actually, one of the comments that's coming up on Slido from a number of interventions was, we haven't touched on it in this conversation, is the role of business and money and global business and lobbying in sowing distrust amongst policy making and for scientific research. I mean, maybe in the context of governance, I'm not sure how we address that thorny issue. Any input?
Well, it's not an easy issue because we know that the global businesses are also interested in the scientific expertise, and the position here of the researcher is not so easy because they have been funded by private funds, but they need to rely on their findings and their, let's say, autonomy and so on, and most of the time we can see, and especially for climate change evidence, that when you are funded by the private sector, it has obviously consequences on the way we are conducting the research, and of course the evidence can be like private driven, which is not obviously what is expected from a researcher, but we also see this type of commitment by the researcher. So yeah.
Do you have any insights on that?
Interest will always be there in the decision-making procedures. It's a human nature that everybody has an interest, that they try to push forward, both scientists, policymakers, everybody in between. That's why it's important to diversify the evidence that we are using. There are different types of evidence. There are not only scientific evidence, but there is data evidence. There are also the citizens' voice. We have to listen to more people, and we have to synthesize. That's why it's very important. And I also wanted to mention that the interlocutors in between scientists and policymakers, the knowledge brokers, they also have a very important role, because they are translating evidence, let it be scientific or whatever other type of evidence, to shape policy decisions. And if I may also reflect just in one sentence, I think science shouldn't influence only decision makers, but science need to inform the policymakers, because at various stages it is not enough if I am influencing from various interests, but it needs to be for the disposal of decision makers to be informed them at any stage of the discourse.
That's interesting. You mentioned interlocutors. I mean, one of the things that's come up in Slido as well from some of the users is the important role of journalists in translating complex scientific knowledge from the world of science and theory down to into the local citizens, the vocabulary that people use on the ground. I'm not sure, Francesco, if you have any comments on how the role of journalists, because we also see that journalists also often are not ideologically neutral in how they present information, and they also often have a certain, and depending on who their paymasters are and what their role is. So maybe how do journalists function in all this, and how can maybe ESPON use more journalistic avenues to try and get that evidence across into policymaking?
I think journalists indeed are not neutral. They tend to cherry pick all too often, unfortunately, scientific information, right? And there's a risk that if they need to, since they need to put scientific evidence findings into a plain language, there's a risk of simplification or oversimplification that kind of also may fuel in the public opinion misjudgment towards science or perceptions that not necessarily correspond to the reality. What we can do about it, what ESPON can do about it, that's a very difficult and complex question. I think journalists definitely need to be trained on how to read through scientific evidence. And they need to understand that, as was well put by Professor Wendt, the scientific world has different views, that there are discussions, that social sciences, and not only social sciences, are not exact sciences, right? Whereas I have the impression that the media coverage of scientific evidence, of scientific works, is often put as if that specific work is something that is very precise and everyone has to agree on it. So I think there's a lot of work to do in this respect.
And I think also that a lot of the work that we do is quite technical and complex, but it's really important, and it's often not a sellable news story, that the type of work that we do, given the fact that it's so important to, especially in the work that you've done, Sébastien, in terms of the populist backlash against kind of system, the overall system. I'm not sure if in your work that you come across any particular areas or regions which are doing better. Is there a particular governance mechanism in particular regions which are doing better? Is there efforts within the regions whereby there's a lot of political distrust of the mainstream effectively? Is there places which are doing better or trying to combat this distrust?
I would say that there are some regions in Europe that are doing well because they created like intermediary bodies as key enablers of the translation of the scientific expertise into policy dialogue and citizenship dialogue. And such type of organizations that are translating evidence into actionable policy options are very important. And from this point of view, in Normandy, there is an assembly where there are researchers and also citizens, representatives of NGOs and so on, and it's functioning well. And this organization is consulted by the president of the region. So I think it's a well-designed governance. But the key aspect here is that the trust and the neutrality of this organization is really important. And relying on this, I think that ESPON is also playing a role as an intermediary body to translate research findings into policy making. Yeah.
I think the root cause of all this, from my perspective, is inequality, ultimately, is at the root cause of this. And actually, some people now look at science as being used as a tool of political oppression, effectively, climate change policies, transition policies, etc. And it seems like and something that's come up on Slido is the fact that some people feel that science has been used as a political tool. I'm not sure in the JRC did you identify any good practices? Is there anything that ESPON can learn from different places in Europe which are doing a better job, especially in places which are so-called the places that have been forgotten places or left behind places, where there's real intervention to try and address this? Or ultimately is it just economic inequality which is at the root cause of this, and it's very difficult to turn around? I know it's a very difficult question to answer.
It's a complex
yeah.
But integration of science into policy making, it doesn't mean that we are annexing science to the decisions and labeling the decisions based on science. But it is more important that how decisions are made. We have to change the mechanism how decisions are made, and we need to embed, as I said, in the policy making cycle everywhere scientific evidence. You just mentioned before that intermediaries are also very important, and the best examples that we found in Europe are those countries where the intermediaries, knowledge brokers, who are translating scientific evidence to policymaking and who are translating the policymaking questions to scientists and keeping the dialogue live, are having a very important role. In some countries, like Estonia, there is a science advisors networks who are embedded in the policy-making cycle, which works well, but also needs a lot of coordination, leadership, and political will. Analytical units linked to the government, for example, in the Czech Republic, are ready to translate scientific evidence, other types of evidence, to decision makings. So the mechanisms work best when science shapes the question, not only answers to it, and when there is a living ecosystem that has a constant dialogue between scientists and policymakers, and there is an interlocutor group in the middle who is translating it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I also add that? I think it's very important that we take the debate and that we are not hiding behind our desks and our screens. Some years ago, I published with a colleague an article about the effect of wind turbines on real estate values and so on. And this was a hotter topic than I had expected, of course, because many of those opposing wind power, they use this as an example, but also people on the other side were calling me and saying, this can't be true, and so on. And I remember in particular one person, he was quite aggressive in the beginning, but we had several long telephone conversations, and in the end, we agreed that, yeah, okay, this is how it is. I had explained everything, how we had calculated and so on. But had I just said that this cuckoo, I don't want to have anything to do with him, then of course, this hadn't happened.
But sometimes I think that if as a scientist, if you're too out there in the media, you become a public intellectual, and sometimes people accuse you of being too far away from the science and too much involved in politics. So I think it's a difficult, tricky balancing act for many scientists to do, because sometimes they feel like they're too engaged in policy discussions, and they need to stick with the science effectively. And sometimes they're told that they need to stick with the science. I'm not sure, Francesco, do you have any view on that or any comment on that? How far scientists should get involved in day-to-day policy and political debates and discussions? Where does the balance lie?
Difficult to say. I mean, I think they need to be out there because they definitely also may be more trusted than policymakers in some respect, especially in some context. But there's a risk that then if the overexposure might indeed backlash not only on the researchers but also on policymakers that are indeed relying on what researchers say. And there's another thing that applies to how media cover the work of researchers and how science is also used by policymakers at large. Sometimes science might convey inconvenient truths, right? And also might feed into policies that are unpopular. Think of the effects of climate policies on some social groups, right? That might be affected more than others without compensatory measures. And there we would face a paradox whereby, in the end, science, I mean, a stronger embedding of science into policymaking and a stronger link between science and policymakers would indeed reinforce the distrust in science rather than the other way around. So we need to be very careful here. And that also applies to how researchers deal with media coverage.
I'm mixing some of the Slido questions with some of the questions that I have here in front of me, but I think one of the things that's coming across on the Slido is, and maybe Sébastien, your best place to speak to this, is a lot of this kind of distrust is driven by fear of the future, because the scale of transition that we have to make when it comes to climate change, and people fear loss of their income, their status, everything they've known, and then there's also the issue of immigration, which we haven't touched on, with a lot of people coming from regions of the world which are badly affected by climate change, a lot more immigration. So I'm not sure how much is fear driving this, and how can we kind of paint a more positive vision of the future?
Well, it's not so easy, and I would say that people are more fearing about changing their behavior than they are fearing about the climate change, which is crystal clear. And in that sense, I think that as researchers, and you mentioned it, we need to be humble, and we need to also recognize that we need to be trained. We need to be trained in policy literacy, in narrative framing, just to be sure that our findings are embedded and they have more impact. So we need to be trained and knowing how decisions are made, how to shape the story. So we never have been trained for this as PhD students, how to frame the discourse and so on. So we need to be humble from this perspective. And I think that having those tools could be useful to know how to talk to those people that are fearing about how those policies will impact their own life and so on.
Yeah, great. What do you think about that?
What is also very important, I very much agree that we need to be trained, but not only we need to be, but everybody needs to be trained. Everybody needs to be trained how to talk to each other. And we also have to create partnerships, communities of practice, where we are involving, we already in the making in the JRC, to create the communities of practice for knowledge brokers. And we are also involving both sides. We are involving scientists, policymakers, but mainly more knowledge brokers, how to work together, how to build a trustful relationship, and how to facilitate the discourse on an everyday basis as well. And I think it's important that, and related to ESPON, that it is not only enough to produce data and publish data and show data to citizens or policymakers, but we also need to build up the stories. We need to build up the stories of this data that are saying something to citizens, so that they also feel part of the discourse.
Yeah, I agree. I think humility is important, because I think a lot of people think that scientists are part of this kind of intellectual elite, and we're part of the conspiracy that is hindering their lives. So I think these stories about how we make a more progressive future, I think, is important. I'm not sure, Francesco, do you have any, or Hans, do you have any view on those, how we change our language, be more humble in our approaches to try and speak in what people call common sense language, or maybe it's better we use the word good sense?
Of course, it's easier to use the language that we have learned to use when we write articles and so on. Then we are more secure. And I think that is perhaps not the real problem, but because if we try to facilitate too much, we also lose the nuances and so on. So it's very much a question of personality. Yeah. We have in Sweden a professor now retired in criminology. He's very popular in TV because he says the things that people agree on and so on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not so scientific, but that's that's the professor almost everybody loves. But everybody cannot be like him. Yeah. No.
Exactly. No, it's true. Francesco, do you any view on that, and how we engage in a discourse which is relevant to people? It speaks to their common concerns and what people want, and rather than being seen as some sort of haughty elite.
I want to strike a positive note. I think in the past 10 to 20 years, we've seen many improvements in how scientists communicate. In our community, especially in the community of regional science, economic geography, we have several examples of scholars that know very well how to communicate the findings, how to talk to policymakers, and how to indeed also make sure that the public at large could understand their findings and what they have to say. I mean, Andrés Rodríguez Poza is perhaps one very notable example of it. I think he's doing a great job in this, and is also helping all the community to make sure that people understand more and more the importance of territorial patterns. So, I mean, his work in terms of communicating the findings, the evidence that come out from this strand of the literature is benefiting all of us, and I think it's a good example of the fact that there are many improvements in this respect.
I agree, and he's done an amazing job of trying to broaden the debate and to get people involved and to understand the territory matters. But I think maybe one thing we haven't just touched on is the role of social media and social media echo chambers in reinforcing certain belief systems. I mean, some people have the view that we just need to disengage from social media a little bit, and because the vast majority of people don't get their news through trusted news sources anymore. Previously, like national broadcasters, etc., they're getting most of their information through social media, which is a certain algorithm which reinforces certain. I'm not. How do we use social media, or should we use social media in trying to translate our message, or is it a waste of time to try and use social media? Or how does social media affect?
I like to use social media, especially Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn, to try to translate in a very understandable way my key evidence about my research. And sometimes I got some interesting comments. But these comments are fueling my research and the way I'm asking the questions in my research. So even if some people are completely disagreeing with, for example, my research or my findings, the feedback that I have from people that are completely disagreeing are also really important in the way we are framing the question. So from this point of view, being engaged in the social media is a way also to understand what people are thinking and so on. So, and then we can adjust also our research to maybe be more embedded in the other realities that are existing in other communities and so on.
How are EU institutions using social media now? Do they have a certain strategy or a certain policy to try and use it, or is it how is JRC, for example, using social media?
Yes, we have a certain service dedicated to that, and we also have policy. And I very much agree with you that social media is a very important source of information as well. A source of information how to understand people's thinking, to understand people's reaction, to understand the logic behind. Of course, there are the algorithms that are beyond this, and I'm not an expert of that, so I don't want to go into details in that. But social media, especially for the new generations, for the younger generations, it is a very important source of information. So nobody can afford not to be present there, and neither policymakers, scientists, and we have to make sure and try to make sure that the information that we are spreading there are understandable, are saying something meaningful and understandable for citizens, for younger people, for different generations, and we have to keep an eye on how we are present there.
Yeah, I think it's important not to disengage totally. Sometimes it feels like you need to disengage from social media because a lot of the negative information, but it's important to listen to that, otherwise we end up in a kind of an echo chamber of our own. But maybe we just turn, for the last few minutes, turn back to what ESPON can do. Like, we feel like we're a very small fish in a very large pond trying to bridge this kind of complex world of science down to policy making. I mean, what can we do, or what type of research initiatives could we do which would help? Is the work that we have been doing to date, I mean, even pre-social media and pre the kind of world zeitgeist that we live in now, we struggled to bridge that gap. It's always a challenge. It's a perennial challenge that we have as an organisation, and we're a small organisation trying to do this. I know others are as well. I mean, what type of initiatives do you think? Any view on what type of initiatives that we could do which would really help this? I mean, events like this today, but we're speaking also to a scientific audience. This is a scientific conference, so we need to try and go beyond that. I'm not sure if anybody got any.
I did many ESPON projects as a researcher, project leader, and one aspect is that in the near future, I would recommend ESPON to explicitly ask the project leader and the consortium in a call for projects to create living labs so that the researchers are obliged in a certain way to put on the table everybody. By the past, I did an ESPON project on COVID-19, and we did policy recommendations. But it was policy recommendations made by researchers, not policy recommendations made by researchers based on a roundtable with policymakers and local institutions and so on. And probably that the policy recommendations we did would have been different if we would have put all together people on the table. So you need to, it needs to be mandatory to ask the researchers to create a living lab, or I don't know what, to be sure that the policy recommendations are not coming from the top to the bottom.
Yeah. I think, well, you're right. I think one of the things that we've been trying to do in recent research is we do a lot of case studies, and we're trying to do work with foresight, scenario planning with researchers, working with them on the ground. But I mean, one of the things we've been trying to do, Alexandra, is work with larger organisations like JRC or the OECD to try and borrow the size of those organisations, to try and work with them rather than working in our own silos. Is there any better opportunities for ESPON to do this, to embed ourselves into those bigger organisations which have got big budgets, and large organisations doing a lot of really good scientific work that sometimes we don't hear about, or it's difficult to find where it is? There's so much work going on.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, and I'm very happy that you mentioned silos, because I think it is also a big problem that, and I think maybe researchers in ESPON also face this issue that most of the researchers are, and not only the researchers but also the policymakers, are living in their own silos, and we are not mixing them. So what I mentioned before, I think just to advise something to ESPON also, what we are also doing in the GRC, not only being a big institution, but we are trying to create communities of practice of both researchers, policymakers, put people together, facilitate the dialogue, understand their point of view, and don't estimate that common sense always present, because common sense is not always common practice. But if we have a partnership and a community of practice in which we work together, then we will be in better position to understand each other.
Hans, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think that ESPON could do something when it comes to stressing the fact that almost all political decisions have consequences in the regional context, in geography and so on. And this is something that politicians most often neglect. They take decisions at the European level, at the national level, but what are the regional consequences of this? Maybe ESPON could be some kind of expert organization in that type of issues, and then I think it would be possible to be heard as well.
Yeah, being heard is what we want to try and achieve. This is our ultimate horizon. We're always trying to achieve to be heard, and it's sometimes difficult to be heard when so much happening in Europe and it's so many people doing this similar work.
Much it is happening in Europe.
Yeah,
so I think researchers also, and also a program like ESPON funding and supporting territorial research, has to cope with this new reality where essentially things are evolving very fast and new priorities are emerging very fast, and perhaps priorities that are very topical today, they may not be topical anymore tomorrow. So, and this clashes a little bit with the time frame of doing our research work, right? So I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges that ESPON and similar organizations or programs are facing right now. I do not have an answer to that. I think there are ways to sort of address this somehow.
You're right, in terms of things changing so quickly. When we started the program, it was very much European Green New Deal, climate change, and now everything is competitiveness and defence. And we feel like maybe cohesion and is falling down the pecking order a little bit. And maybe that's an interesting way to almost finish this discussion. And there's so much useful comments coming in from on Slido that we can't get to all of them, but I think we've touched on many of them here, and I think this debate will go on long after. There's something which I think has really provoked a lot of comment and feedback. But looking to the future in terms of where we stand now, you mentioned the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist is changing. Competitiveness, defence is becoming to the top of the political. Where do you see research going in the future? I mean, do we see these trends continuing? How can we, I don't know, how can we stem some of these populist political backlashes against the overall European cohesion project? Any thoughts on that? Any philosophical perspectives on the future that you'd like to finish on? Or I know it's a difficult one. Yeah.
I think, and I think I already said many times, we need to maintain this dialogue. We need to maintain the relationship between the different parties, and also to challenge the centralized decisions a bit, to challenge it from local points of views, to involve the local actors as co-creators of decisions. And like this, even if the future is unknown, we can already have the input from the citizens level and from the local actors level, how to make better policies for the future, not only from a centralized point of view.
Would you agree that decentralization is key? Are we becoming too centralized?
Yeah, definitely. And we need also to ensure that the science is timely, relevant, and used. We need, as ESPON, for example, you need also to talk more with associations like the EURADA, EuroCities, ACR+, Association of Mayors, and so on, because it's associations that are trying to be more bottom-up and to be the voice of the local authorities and so on. So they are really embedded in the reality and the issues that are really relevant. And at the same time, even if we are talking now about the defense, AI, and so on, it's not because we are talking about those new issues that we need to not address anymore more bigger issues like climate change, for example. Even it's less, let's say, important now in the political debate. I think that we need to continue to push this to ensure that the local authorities are also aware about the fact that there are some important topics that we must not forget, even if some mayors or elected officials don't want to talk about.
The whole question of AI is something we even haven't touched on, but there will be a session in the afternoon on AI. So, I mean, that's another aspect of this whole debate, which we're only starting to understand now. But you've been thinking about these issues for a long time. What do you think about the current zeitgeist and where are you optimistic for the future of research? Are we going to?
Well, I need to be, even if in the short run I'm not very optimistic, but this is a marathon race.
Yeah. Okay. And you, Francesco, you're optimistic about you mentioned optimism earlier on, so we need to be optimistic about how we can break down these silos and bridge this gap.
We need to be optimistic. However, it's true that with a certain number of new policy priorities, we've been seeing pivoting toward more centralized and top-down policies. But this comes with a risk, because all policies, after all, they have strong territorial implications and they have uneven effects across territories. So if we don't look enough into these effects, and this is the role of researchers, then the risk is that we will end up with more territorial disparities and thus more distrust toward institutions and science. So,
yeah, no, I agree. I think we can end on that optimistic note, and we could talk about this all day. I think in terms of this is a really fascinating issue, but unfortunately, we need to bring this discussion to an end. And thanks again to our panelists. It's been a really rich and enlightening conversation for the last hour or so. Thanks for your contributions. It's been fantastic. And thanks for all of those who have been providing comments via Slido. I didn't get to them all because there's so much information coming in. And also thanks to all those behind the cameras who've allowed this session to happen so smoothly. Really appreciate all of you, all the work. So we'll now have a short break until 11:15, and our next session will then start. We have three panelists, as I mentioned. We'll discuss AI for territorial futures, scientific innovation, policy intelligence, and European spatial planning. So I think it follows on nicely from the discussion we've just been having. So all that's left for me now is to say thanks again to everybody and goodbye. And I really enjoyed hosting this opening session. And I wish you all a very interesting next sessions and a really nice day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.